Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this One Voice for Manufacturing webinar on the recent tariff announcements made by the Trump administration. Because this webinar is being recorded, I'm going to note that this webinar is being presented on Monday, February 3rd, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern. It's important to timestamp these announcements because things are changing really so quickly in the context of these tariffs, which were first put in place on February 1st. In the course of this webinar, you're going to hear from Omar Nashashibi at Inside Beltway and also Paul Nathanson at the Policy Resolution Group here with me at Bracewell. We do want to leave time for people to ask questions, but we have over 300 people on this webinar already, certainly an indication of the interest in the topic. So to try to make it a little bit easier to ask your questions, we'll ask that you either type your question into the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A and not the comment feature. And then we'll also, towards the end of the webinar, allow for folks to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question that way. So jump in with the Q&A feature. As you might guess, with so many people participating, we probably won't be able to get to every question, but we'll certainly do our best and then be able to follow up with people or share other information another way. With that, I don't want to take any more time on logistics. If you have any questions or logistical issues, please do use the Q&A feature to reach out to us. Omar and Paul, well, I guess I'll do it this way. Let me start by turning it over to Omar to give everybody a sense of what's going on now. And I know you, Paul, will be jumping in as well throughout the quick update here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul's going to do this slide with me because he and I really lived through what we call, my wife laughs at me when I say this, the TikTok of the events of the last few days. Starting with, obviously, let's go even before this to the election and pre-election that the president did obviously say that he was going to do some kind of tariff action on our allies and non-allies alike, and he has started. So Friday, Paul, we did just see the announcements. He said tariffs are coming tomorrow, but that was the issue first flag that we all had to deal with. When the president says tariffs are coming tomorrow, does that mean they were going to be implemented on February 1st or announced on February 1st? So Paul, while you and I were traveling together, we did see an announcement.
Yeah, and then there was a media story that broke that they're going to be announced and they'll take place March 1st. And then the White House press secretary said, no, they're going to be announced tomorrow and take place right away. And so when Omar and I were traveling together, we kind of just were hitting our refresh, and then they were announced on Saturday, as you see here, that 25% tariffs on Mexico, 25% tariffs on Canada, with 10% on Canadian energy, and we'll get to that, how that is defined. And then also a hit on 10% tariff on additional tariff on Chinese imports. So Omar, then you took out your 5 screens and 2 computers, and you could take it from there.
That's right. And that brings us from our Saturday now into our Sunday. And that's when we actually start to see paper. So for folks like me, we can't just work on speculation. I've got Bloomberg on one, CNBC on another, and they're saying all kinds of things, especially throughout this weekend. It's the paper that we finally got on Sunday that we're going to run through a little bit. And yes, it's still fluid with regards to what's going on Mexico this morning. I do have the retaliatory list from Canada, and I will put that up in a link on a few slides. We only have about maybe 16, 17 slides. Our hope is to stop speaking at around 2:30 today and have you all start being able to interact with us. As Caitlin indicated already, we've got a couple of questions in the question and answer box. Please continue to do that on where we stand right now. Let's just go right into the who, what, where, why, when, how. Yes, it's all 3: Canada, Mexico, China. To put it in perspective, the trade engagement with Canada is roughly overall 14.8% of all trade is with Canada, 14.1% all trade is with Mexico, 11.8% all trade with China. So taken together, you've got 30% of all trade with Canada and Mexico. And over that, really, when you add all in, the third with the 3 of them. That's how significant this action is. Again, the announcement, as Paul mentioned, we've got a 25% tariff on Mexico that is now, as of a couple hours ago, suspended possibly until March 1st. But for all other intents and purposes, right now we're at 2:07 Eastern on February 3rd. Tonight at 12:01 a.m. on February 4th, unless we see something different, and please interrupt me, Paul or Caitlin, while I'm speaking if we do get another announcement, the tariffs on Canada and on China will take effect. As of this morning, last night rather, the latest we'd heard from the Hill is word was the Canadians are not expecting a resolution prior to today. They are expecting talks to continue into later February, and they were not in the similar position as Mexico. And as of right now, that proves present as we get closer to that timeline with about 10 hours, just under 10 hours to go for that to come in. We're going to talk about what it means if it's already been loaded on a vessel. So on the water, there is a slight reprieve, but not by much on that as well. And then most importantly, how they're doing this is under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEPA. Those of you that have seen one of our presentations around the election and post-election have certainly heard from us with regard to this important rule that came out there. This is a link. This is the president's fact sheet that they put out on Saturday. The fact sheet came out before we got the executive orders announcing that he was going to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. We'll refer to it from here on out as IEPA. Under IEPA, the intent of that is to permit the president to impose sanctions or restrict the movement of goods, people, or resources, including funds, across the border, typically as related to how it works on goods that are coming across. It's typically done, though, on human rights issues, genocide, but the International Economic Emergency Powers Act has been used. This marks roughly the 40th. I've heard this might even be the 45th IEPA action that has been taken since the law went into effect in the 1970s. This will give you a sense of how this looks and how you can use it. You can prohibit transactions with block property. You can prohibit transactions for those designated in different kind of illicit trades. So you're seeing this is going to be the foundation of how the president moves quickly without having to go through a public comment period. There are other trade laws that the president is currently going to use after he receives reports back by April 1st. That'll be related to trade imbalance. That's the conversation you'll have on South Korea, on Japan, on the Europeans under Section 122 of the trade laws. And then, of course, expanding Section 232 on national security. We know there are active conversations right now on expanding that tariff action from beyond just the steel and aluminum that was already listed. But here, let's just go ahead and get started right now on the three countries. We're going to start with Mexico, go on to China, and then get into Canada, and then discuss some of the provisions that apply across the board, and then start discussing what folks can start doing with their customers, and also how you can take advantage of it and try to source some folks back into reshoring and nearshoring and all those issues. Here's the facts: 25% tariff on Mexico have been announced, and this is coming straight from that executive order. This is slightly different than the one separate that was issued for China and for Canada. They are all specific at the top in terms of the findings where they seek to address these different issues and the different topics that are there. This one obviously is based on trafficking, criminals at large, illicit drugs, and that's how he ends up using that provision. However, just a few hours ago at 10:41 Eastern, the president put out this, I don't know what you call it, Caitlin, it's not a tweet. It's whatever on Truth Social. He put out this post saying that he spoke with Claudia Sheinbaum, she's the president of Mexico, and that they are not going to proceed at 12:01 a.m. with the tariff on all products. And we should clarify that exactly as what Paul said. The words in these executive orders say all articles that are produced in the People's Republic of China, all products that are articles that are produced in Mexico and in Canada. That's how it was written up. So it applies to everything. And that's how this is so critical, why we're not giving you a list of all goods that are subject to a 25% tariff from Canada or 10% from China, because it's all goods. And that's how to approach it. But with this now social media post this morning, and now he'll have to, I don't think he issued the official Federal Register notice yet on Mexico, so he may not have to backtrack on this legally, but this will halt that. Note that with the president, of course, if he doesn't feel that there's progress on the Mexican side of the border related to this, he certainly can come back and change his mind and then reimpose and start to have those tariffs take effect then as well. When we get a sense of which direction and how the negotiations might be going on the Mexico side, we would suggest that you do have a little bit of a calm period, I think, for the next few weeks. The closer, though, that we get towards the end of the month, then the less certainty we're going to have on what exactly the next step is. Many of us did believe that we were looking more of a March 1 implementation date all along, but once Trump usually hears people saying that, he tends to do the opposite, which is a lot of what we got here. You also have to factor in that with Canada and Mexico, the president put out an order on January 20th saying he wants to expedite negotiations under the USMCA rather than waiting for 2026 to moving it to this year. So for those of us that believe that tariffs fall into buckets, the tariffs on Canada and Mexico are in large part a negotiation bucket as opposed to a punitive or a fundamental change and realignment of supply chain. So as of now, they are not on Mexico, effective for the 1201 tomorrow morning, but they are on China. It's important to note all three executive orders all use the exact same verbiage that these tariffs are in addition. So these are 25% additional tariffs on China or on Canada or on Mexico. So if the steel and aluminum tariffs were back in place that the president has suspended, if the 25% tariff on steel on Canada were in place today, which he could reinstate it, this tariff action of tonight will be in addition to that. But since they are technically suspended under the new NAFTA, yes, your steel products would be subject to a 25% tariff coming in from Canada, and also your aluminum, of which they are a large significant supplier of ours. They are going to be subject also to a 25% tariff on aluminum goods that are articles that are brought in from there as well. The additional 10% on China is also key because we do not have tariffs suspended. Rather, we have multiple lines of tariffs that have been implemented on this. This, as you will see, is the 10% duty rate on all products coming in. You'll see all articles that are produced in the People's Republic of China. And this is all February 4th, with that one exception that we'll talk about on the warehousing side. When we put into context what the word in addition means, this is how you'll see it. The 10% rate is on top of the Section 301 tariffs. President Trump imposed the 25% tariff on over 6,800 goods in 2018. Former President Biden increased some of those tariff lines and added those on top. And so this is a simple game of math. You're doing 25% plus the existing Section 301 25%. Well, then on those cases, how Biden got there, in this tariff action that Trump's doing, he's adding 10% on top. So for those categories that Biden took to 50% in September, those are now 60. For those that a few weeks ago went up to 100, those are 110. Similar, the baseline for those 6,800 imports that are here, that's now a 35% tariff on Chinese imports as of tonight. So if you are bringing in input coming in from China, it is now going to likely be subject to at least a 17.5, but in your cases, most likely a 35% tariff, and that's effective 1201 this morning coming in tonight. When we also take next steps on this, for those of you that are bringing in metal products that are covered by the Section 232 and the Section 301, because you do have products where former President Biden increased the tariff rate on certain steel up to 25 under his latest action, that then added that with the 25% of the Section 232. That's how you got to the 50% on certain steel imports under Biden several months ago. This again is on top of that. Then the last factor, so you have your 232 plus your 301 in addition to the new 10% action. This is your new number for importation coming in from China. When you look at the next steps on it, then we have to say, what about anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which can in some cases exceed 200%. And yes, this is in addition to any other fees that are collected, and that includes duty rates that are there. The last country that we'll talk about, and then we'll go into some general topics that are in here, and then start beginning to go through some of the questions that we're receiving, is on Canada. This one has clearly gotten the most pushback from the Canadian government out of the three different areas. We've seen Mexico City come to the table quickly, as she did, but did not come with a list of retaliatory products already floated in the media as the Canadians were doing, which felt that they were giving themselves a little less room to negotiate the Canadians as opposed to the Mexicans. We also have to keep in mind the Canadians are effectively rudderless without having a stable leadership there, with Trudeau having to step down and look for new elections in the nearby. And Trump is certainly trying to take advantage of that situation. We have two tiers of tariffs on imports coming in from Canada. So let's inverse it, and we can just, the 10% will be on energy products that we'll touch on, but let's use the blanket inaccurate statement right now of all articles that are coming in from Canada are subject to that 25% tariff rate starting again tonight at 12:01. The one exception is the articles that are made out of energy, and the energy ones, they come in and they do actually list them here in section 8 of an order that was put, it's called the American Energy Independence Order, that was put out on January 20th by President Trump. What he does in this action on Canada is he goes back and he references the language that he put in that one as the definition for energy resources for Canada. So all of these items will be subject to a 10% tariff tonight at 12:01 a.m. Anything not on this list will be subject to the 25% tariff that's on there. We've already begun to see some information coming back from the Canadians and prior to today from Mexico on retaliation. I don't want to overly speculate on where we might be with the Canadians, and Paul had asked, or excuse me, on the Chinese and where Beijing might be on their retaliation, but we've seen quite a bit from Canada, even just in the last few hours. This is a link to their press release, Paul.
Yeah, the Canadians have always been very good, dating back to 201 days, dating back to others too. They have probably the most sophisticated embassy operation here in Washington D.C., and so they have are targeting their tariffs, and some of them we could have predicted. A lot of them, Omar, I don't know if you have if you included a list on this PowerPoint, but Florida oranges are on there. Harley Davidson is on there. They tend to look at red states and exports that are coming from red states and target those to inflict as much pain as possible. One issue that, going back a couple slides, that on the why is he lowering on the 10% on energy products? Because we import a lot of energy products from Canada, from hydro to oil. There are refineries in the United States that import hundreds of thousands of barrels of Canadian oil. So that's why it's a lower rate. It's for self-interest. So the Canadians have put out a preliminary list of retaliatory tariffs that they are going to impose on these products, and they're mostly based on how to inflict most pain and political pain on the Trump administration. Omar.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for that. I think that color was helpful as well. We got a couple of good questions in here as well, and I think a lot of my answer is going to be yes, the tariff does apply to your questions on the vast majority that were asked. We'll get to those in a minute. We did want to provide a link for those that are going to want to go in here. This link down at the bottom just came out about just before noon Eastern, and that ended up giving us the exact list of the initial $30 billion tariff retaliatory line. The Canadians announced last night $106 billion worth of U.S. goods that would be subject to tariffs. This is the initial $30 billion tranche. There will be another list that will be that remaining $86 billion, and that is going to be released within the next 21 days as they allow, not released, rather, that will be consulted for the next 21 days as he tries, Trudeau said, to give their manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, others a little bit of time to start looking for alternatives to United States inputs. So it is going to be pretty expansive. These two examples obviously are not universal for what our members use in One Voice, but we did want to at least show you what it will look like when you click on this. A few things to note that are not on this $30 billion list. We did not see articles under Chapter 72, 73, 76 for the most part, which are parts that are made of steel or aluminum or iron. They left that for the majority. There's some silverware, there's cooking items and utensils, there's washing machines that are in there, dishwashers are in there. So they do have some of those under Chapter 84 machinery, but the machine tools that are on there, the tools that are on there are hand tools and not machine tools as of now on the retaliatory list of American-made goods going into Canada. So those are not currently on this. We also did not see, so chapters 80 and 87, I did not see automotive fall into this yet on the retaliation side. So for those of you now that we'll get into the questions in a minute, that have a part that might be moving across the border 3 or 4 times, from the U.S. perspective, yeah, it is subject to a tariff each time it enters into the United States Customs Authority, even though it might have already had one previously because duty drawback's not included in this. But then also you might be looking at a situation where on the Canadian side, they are not tariffing it in right now for the next 21 days. But if you're added to that broader $86 billion list, then yes, you then might hit a round trip tariff both in the US and out as well, where we come to. So the retaliatory provisions, this is again, just an example you can go through, but we didn't see as many on this list initially as we thought that they would be for what the vast majority of our One Voice members manufacture. You are on that list, some of you, but not yet all of you, or the majority of you. Here's the language that the president included, excuse me, in each of the 3 of his executive orders released yesterday, beginning with the quotation. Should any of the governments, quote, retaliate against the United States in response to this action through import duties or similar measures, meaning you can do non-tariff barriers to entry. That is another measure to respond to the United States. The president may increase or expand in scope the duties that are imposed under that executive order. So that is something that we do anticipate. And this is that round robin that you're going to look at. If the Canadian tariffs do take effect, which they are scheduled to do tomorrow, February 4th, then how does the president respond? Does he respond on February 5th? Does he keep going every day? What is the next step to escalation? If you start with 25, what's the next number? Is it like the Treasury Secretary, 2.5 points a day? These are things that they're going to have to start considering and factoring this as well. But this is obviously the president putting everyone on notice that that's where they're going to. We've got just 2 more slides, and then we're going to pause there and start going through some questions. And I welcome Paul and Caitlin and others to jump in. And Caitlin will remind everyone what the best way to answer, or excuse me, to ask questions here as well. Caitlin, why don't you go ahead and just start that process, and then I'll finish off our last 2 slides.
Yeah, please, if you've got questions, we are receiving them if you're submitting them through the Q&A. We also have the ability to unmute people, so you can raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask a question. We'll probably take some of the ones submitted first, since we can see them in the queue, and then we'll call on people. We'll let you know before we unmute you. We will give you a warning. Okay.
Appreciate that, Caitlin. 2 last ones here, and these again apply to all of the orders, and so all 3, although obviously Mexico is a little bit less relevant than it was prior to. So right now, the timeline for imports on the water. Question we got all the time, in particular when it came to steel and aluminum 232s. This is what we will call our on the water. And it's really only giving you a reprieve for a couple of days. So if you had entered, or if you had left on a vessel, loaded onto a vessel at the port of loading or in transit to the final mode of transport, prior to entry to the United States at 12:01 a.m. Eastern on February the 1st, this is Saturday morning, turning the clock in a Saturday, then you are not subject to that additional duty. There are going to be a handful of the 300, nearly 400 people that are on this call that have something on the water. This is your language. This is your language that you go to your broker and you get your timestamp and you figure out when was it loaded. This can matter between, this is the difference between 25% and 0, 10% tariff and 0. Other than this, there is no other, oh, it was already on the water, then you can work something out. No, that is not the case. This has to have been done prior to, so if somebody ships something on Saturday or Eastern time, then no, that is not going to count. It had to have done Friday or prior to it. The other one here is on duty drawback and on de minimis. De minimis is not going to affect this group nearly as much, but duty drawback will. Duty drawback, this is the quote, and this is the description from Customs and Border Protection website. Duty drawback is the refund of certain duties, read tariffs, internal revenue taxes, certain fees collected upon the importation of goods and refunded when that merchandise is exported. So you automotive and some of you other folks, often you are bringing a product in, it sits with you for a little bit and then goes right back out. Or you're in a foreign trade zone, for example, and some of the FTZs, those are addressed separately. Reach out to us and we can try to walk you through that process. But note, duty drawback is not eligible. So if you had anticipated, because I'm bringing this product in, then I'm further processing it for export only, that is not recourse for you. You will still be subject on that 25% tariff on that input that comes in there. So with that, we wanted to stop right at the 2:30 or so mark with at least the slides that we've got. Please do note that we are obviously in a very, very fluid situation and that we are bringing you the best that we can. We do believe that this slide deck will be updated again, likely later this week. We will put out additional information for folks once we get more Federal Register notices that are published. We are expecting sometime today for those of you that are active importers to receive an HTS numbers that will align, that you're going to have to put into your ACE system for importation. It's likely going to start with a chapter 99 dot something, and that's typically what they'll have to do for all goods that are going to be subject to this additional tariff order that's on there. So that's something to look out for once we do have that Federal Register notice. If it has not been posted yet, hadn't seen it as of this morning, we will certainly get that out to everyone to help with some of their compliance there. Caitlin, if you don't mind, I'm going to let you kind of run the show here and we'll kind of go in between and start answering questions between the three of us, however you'd like to start.
Great. I am happy to. I'm going to try to group some of the questions together that are coming in through the Q&A, so that we can address as many as possible. We've gotten a number of questions about auto parts, which I think is not surprising, given One Voice's membership. In particular, some of the questions are about retaliatory tariffs if you supply auto parts to Canada. Asking what we think might happen there. Other questions, and there's a few like this, are, what if you're in a business where you are making a part here in the US, but then you're shipping it across to Canada to have some work done on it, and then it's coming back, whether and how tariffs might impact a product like that. So I'll stop there. I'll get a few more, but that's a top issue based on the questions that are in.
Absolutely. And that's where the big concern is from the automotive OEMs and tier ones in particular. We do know that a part can cross the borders up to 8 times. We know there's some members that are actually on this call where they've got a part that goes over 3 or 4 times, particularly to Mexico. And so the way to read this is back to my comment on Canada and their 21-day for their next list versus the list that they have out right now. Every time that product crosses the United States border entry, it will again be subject to that tariff. Again, I'm not a trade lawyer, so if we do get additional clarifications, we will get that to you. But as of right now, every time that product moves across the border into entry, even if it was subject to a tariff previously, it will be considered a transaction, especially in the case where it's further modified or now has a new HTS code. Sometimes when you're doing coating or heat treating, it doesn't necessarily change, it might change the function, but it doesn't necessarily change the form or give you a new HTS code. In some cases, a coating will change the HTS code for it. But in this case, if you're looking at a blanket from the United States standpoint, they didn't differentiate. So it's not like one of those where you can take a die and then further manufacture it and now it's a new product, or take the steel and stamp it and now it's a stamping. They're not, the US government's not differentiating among harmonized tariff schedule codes with the exception of energy from the Canadians. So this means that those products are going to keep coming back and forth. And so that's where we are going to see that come down and be a real challenge for increasing the cost of that product, because you're going to have a declaratory value for that product and then have to go back and forth and be subject to the tariff, which of course is going to increase the cost, which is why the OEM automotive folks this week have said that they're anticipating a typical sticker increase of about $3,000 on average per vehicle that's out there. So now let's take the inverse of that as Caitlin gets ready for the additional questions. So if it's coming into the United States, as of right now in the reading, is yes, it would be subject to the tariff each time it entered the United States from Canada. And this can and potentially would apply to Mexico down the line. Then the other side is seeing what would happen on the Canadian side. When you're entering Canada, is it today eligible, subject to the tariff? Most likely the answer is no, based on what I know you all make. You'd have to look at that link that we put on there on the Canadian retaliation. Then when the Canadians put out their broader list of $86 billion worth of goods, then you really need to look at your harmonized tariff schedule code very closely to see if it appears on that. Because if it does get on there, then yes, it's a double hit. It gets hit on the way to Canada because now they've covered your HTS code, if in fact they do. And then it'll get hit on its way back into the United States because all products are subject to either that 10 or 25% tariff.
Okay, thanks, Omar. And there were a lot of questions that came in about that. About, crossing the border more than once, possibly, or, for different processes happening on either side of the border. So hopefully that addressed some of the issues. A couple of people have asked whether this webinar will be available after the fact. Yes, it will. It is being recorded and will be available, sent by email, and also posted online at onevoiceinfo.org. I believe it will also be on the PMA YouTube channel, so you can see it there. One pretty specific question that we've gotten is someone listening asks, if I have goods in port of export pending shipping, will they be subject to the additional 10% tariffs on molds and dyes?
It goes back into that question on the 12:01 a.m. If it's pending in shipping, yes, they are subject unless they've already. So you've got two questions. If they have not been shipped or entered onto that vessel for loading prior to 12:01 on Saturday morning, they will be subject. And if they have not, if that's for in transit, and if they're not entered into a U.S. designated customs authority, whether it's in the Caribbean or mainland U.S. by 12:01 a.m. tonight, it will be subject to the 25% tariff.
One person's asking, and I think because you've referenced it a few times, it's important to underline it. What's the best source for this group to see the list and the HTS codes for items coming into the US?
For items coming into the US, I can put a link in there. It's simple. If you want to just Google HTS ITC, at least on my computer, that always pops up. The first link will be there, are the harmonized tariff schedule codes put out by the U.S. International Trade Commission. The U.S. ITC updates that list once a year, every January. They might put out revisions through the year, but typically every January we'll put out a new HTS list. And the way HTS codes are done is they are organized by chapter and going from 1 all the way till 98, 99. So you'll go into automotive, chapter 87, machinery is typically going to be under 84, 85. Munitions, ordnances have their own, steel and aluminum have their own as well. So that's typically how they'll look and how they're organized. And that's something that we strongly encourage you all to become familiar with your products, not only of what you make, but what your suppliers might be bringing to you, what your competitors might be doing as well. And they did actually just release the 2025 HTS edition. So we'll put that link here into the chat as well. And I strongly encourage you all to take a look at that and go from there.
Okay, great. A couple of people are still asking this, so I think just to make sure we're being super clear, the questions that are coming in are talking about and I see it in a couple of questions here, the phrase services rendered in Canada, right? So a part is stamped at a facility in the US, then it's sent to Canada for something like plating services. Some other people describe other services, and then sent back to us. And I think, Omar, what you are advising here is that those goods are subject to tariffs, both leaving and coming back when they cross the border. A couple of people are asking that question, with that specificity.
Yes. And so quality inspections, packaging services, for example, so not even going to the level of assembly. So I understand absolutely. Those are very valid questions. As of right now, they do not differentiate between a value added, a further manufacturing, or even providing some of those quality and inspection services. Therefore, if that product is moving across the border, it is considered a transaction as it is physically moving across the border, and it would be subject to the tariff. Your only reprieve is if you're not adding to the value of that product, your tariff margin may not be coming in as any higher than might have been when it left. But as of the reading thus far is if it's moving across the border, the safer assumption as of right now is to assume that the tariff applies.
Okay. Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that it's the crossing of the border and not the services that are being rendered that is connected to the tariff. So for people who are asking about different services, I think that's the guidance that Omar's explaining there.
We can, sorry, okay, we can only take
Yeah.
it as literally as the language that we've seen and the language that we saw, and I don't want to make people dizzy by sharing my screen, but remember when I emphasized all articles from the originating from the PRC? That's the phrase that we're hanging on until we hear something different, because whether it received additional services, inspection, it's an article, and therefore to take it literally means all articles that are crossing the border.
Okay.
I also think it's important to note that everything we're telling you is valid as of 2:38 p.m. Eastern time on February 3rd, and the way that this has worked in the past and in the first Trump administration and is already that we've seen over the last 2 days is things can change in a hurry, and that's why you should keep an eye out on your emails and also on the announcement that the One Voice team makes, because things will. I can guarantee you things will change in the next day, in the next week, and before March 1st for Mexico. So what we're telling you now is what we know as of just this moment, and it will likely change.
Thanks, Paul. That is a helpful reminder and clarification. A couple of people, and so we have some crystal ball questions here that I'll let you guys think about for a second. People are asking whether we might expect to see the tariffs on Canada postponed as the tariffs for Mexico were. So that, is a little bit of a prediction question if folks want to weigh in on that. But I also want to flag a question that I think sort of a political question that I think is interesting. The question is, what have you heard about the reasons for these tariffs? So this person asking the question said, for those people who might not necessarily believe the administration's claims that the tariffs are related to drugs or to immigration. But I think even setting aside the question of belief, I think that is an interesting question about what the reasons might be, and thus like what our trading partners might be considering in terms of ways to have them ultimately lifted. So I think taking those questions together, one, is there going to be, do you anticipate possibly having a delay with all the usual caveats about how things are changing so quickly? Also, questions about what might be the reason behind the tariffs that are being implemented. I think we have several questions about that. And then just one more to add to that string of questions. I think this is related. A person is asking how quickly should they be implementing this, right? So this person says, we ship parts to Canada and to Mexico. Should we be including a tariff surcharge starting, this person says, tomorrow or immediately? So those three questions sort of group together, and I will collect a few more over the next couple of minutes.
Well, Omar, let me take the stated reasons, and look, there had to be a reason because he's using AIPA, his emergency powers. The stated reason is he declared a national emergency premise on the influx of illicit opioids and other drugs, the fentanyl issue, where the Canadian Trudeau claims it's like what, Omar, 0.001 of the fentanyl is coming through Canada, but the crisis on the border and the drugs coming through the border was the stated reason why he is imposing these tariffs on Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, I think that's correct. When I look at the tariff actions right now, we have them in buckets. What are the buckets where he wants to bring somebody to the negotiating table? Where are the buckets that he wants to just punish for behavior that he doesn't like or trade imbalances? And then another one where he actually sees tariffs, a base tariff rate, as a fundamental part of industrial manufacturing policy, which there are people in the White House that do want to see a baseline tariff rate across the board, irrespective of the other conflicts that are out there. So let's go back to what I said about July of 2026 and the USMCA negotiations. This is a pressure point in order to expedite those talks because he does not want those to happen in an election year for the midterms next year. He wants to get that all done right now and bring everybody to the table. This is his way of doing it, and he can hit the Canadians while they're weakest and the Mexicans while they have a new president. She came in October 1st. So there's a lot of moving parts that he's doing this, but anyone that looks at USMCA only in the context of United States, Canada, and Mexico is missing the long-term play that Trump's got here, and that's China. When we're going to do our comments as One Voice on the Hill on last Thursday, talking to the House China Committee on transshipment and transnational subsidies, the Chinese are running manufacturing plants in Mexico, and they're shipping parts made in Mexico by Chinese workers into the United States. Trump is trying to get out ahead and bring all these issues onto the table at once. And this is how he's starting to press and force those negotiations as well. So there's a number of things that are happening from one side or the other for Trump to bring these apart. And on China, some say he wants a grand deal with China. Who knows if that's possible, but he's going to continue to ramp up. On China, it's a little bit more deliberate because if you go too far, then you push China away and there's no reason for them to come back if you start at 100% with them. So we see more of a gradual increase on that front. To the other question on speculation on what will happen with Canada. This is true speculation. We had somebody with Premier Ford's office reach out to us through a manufacturer a few weeks ago, seeing if he can get into Trump. And now you've seen Ontario start to threaten, and not threaten, but to pull contracts and impose their own restrictions on U.S. So the way the Canadians are playing this is they're getting their back up more in an offensive posture rather than negotiating posture. And with their election coming up, the candidates cannot look like they're appeasing to Trump if they want to win, which puts them in a more difficult situation. So will there ultimately be an agreement? Yeah, of course, we think there will be an agreement. But in the short term, do we think that Canada will have the Mexico treatment in the next 24 hours? That looks highly, highly unlikely at this point.
And the reason that, by the way, you say, well, China doesn't border the United States. So what was the reason for the emergency? It's these sustained influx of synthetic opioids that come from China through the border.
Yeah, and I know this call is just on the trio right now, but you better believe we might be having this webinar on the European Union in the next 2 weeks or so.
Yep.
Omar, you just made the point that tariffs could expand. One of the people on the call has asked about imports of stainless steel from India and whether India might appear on a future list. Not asking you to opine on that country specifically, but should we take your comments about the EU to assume that lots of countries could be on a future tariff list, knowing what you guys just said about the Trump administration liking to use tariffs as a foreign policy or other policy tool?
It's an excellent question. India came up in a Hill conversation last week with committee as well, and a few thoughts on that. We saw India just this week announce that it was going to lift some of the import restrictions on certain goods that it's had for decades. And this has been a big priority of the United States negotiators going back to Obama era, whether it's related to medical devices, pharmaceuticals. There's a number of categories that the Indians have restricted their importation or applied significant duties and tariffs to. And they just made the announcement, I want to say over the weekend, if not Friday, to that effect. So I think the questioner is leaning right into where we might end up, as the Indians already are seeing where this might end up going. I will qualify, though, that I do not see him treating India the same as China, despite what some manufacturers in the U.S. here might want to see as the rise of India continues, as he needs Modi. He's got a 2,000-kilometer border that he's dealing with China over there. He's got to get the Indians to stop buying Russian munitions and weapons, and he wants them to buy more from the U.S. So yes, a threat at some point on India is likely coming, but he had a good enough relationship with Modi is we don't expect it to get to this point where we're all on the brink, like Paul said, hitting refresh on a weekend for tariffs.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if importing steel from India, remember, we still have the Section 232 tariffs out there. And as Omar indicated, that, there is a expectation that those tariffs will draw, that President Trump will focus on those tariffs soon, maybe take away the tariff rate quotas, maybe adjust the levels of those tariffs. As you may recall, India had threatened retaliation the first time around when those tariffs were imposed, and they decided not to retaliate with the promise that the exclusion process would be more fair to folks who are importing from India. So I agree, Omar, that with India, you do have, if you're importing from India, a bright spot is that President Trump seems to have a very good relationship with Prime Minister Modi, and the complaints about Indian exports to the U.S. were not part of the campaign themes, or are brought up very often right now.
Caitlin, we're at 2:48. Maybe I'll just run through off my mind a few of these from inside the Q&A box, and if you want to get ready or maybe open up a mic for a couple of those that raise their hands, if that works for you. All right. I saw a couple other questions here, again, related to engineering services and other services. If you are providing a service remotely, meaning you're physically located in Canada or located in the United States, or you have a machine you installed in Canada and you're calling them and providing them support that you bill them by the hour for, that does not seem at this point to be subject to a tariff. Those services still be there. I will go back and still go back and read it literally as all articles, and then that moves. The question someone asked about, what about an empty box or containers, or even I guess that would go to wood pallets. I don't want to go down that path on an empty box. That is a very valid question. Let me see if we can find that, because I think that's not necessarily unique, probably is a bit more common on those shipping back and forth there as well. But Caitlin, I'll turn it over to you if there is anyone you want to open the mic for.
Yeah, sure. Let's go to Eric, who's had his hand raised for a while. Eric, you should get a notification that you have the ability to speak, and you'll have to unmute.
As you're doing that, if you just hit unmute, we'll see your mic come white, and you can go ahead and ask a question. Maybe while he's doing it, Caitlin.
To be clear, Eric Funkhauser, that's who we are trying to call on. And then we also have Stephen DeHart in the queue. So we could give him the opportunity to ask his question as well. If Eric, you or Stephen are still in front of your computers and want to unmute and ask your question, you should have a prompt on your screen.
Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. My question was just about the distribution of the information we were looking at, and he answered that earlier, so we're good.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So to that effect, Eric, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Omar.
No,
Eric,
please.
Unmuted. Go ahead, Eric. Briefly unmuted.
Okay, Caitlin, I think we had one more.
Yeah, Dragon, I see you also have your hand raised. If you're getting a prompt to unmute, go ahead.
Nope, it took his hand down. Okay, so I think we're good on many of those questions. We saw a few more come in here. What about countries like Korea and Taiwan? And for the record, we're here for the rest of the hour. Obviously, we'll stick with you 10 minutes. So if you have more questions, stay in. We will not cut this off early until you want us to. A few things in here: Korea, Taiwan. We would apply that language also to and Indonesia, to what Paul said on India. They are all subject to tariffs. We gave presentation several months ago on the different tools that the president has. We believe that the IEPA, that's the one that he's using right now, that allows the most immediate action by the president. The next steps are going to involve investigations where you have to have a formal finding, recommendation, and public comment period, which is what the president requested for April 1st. And he has requested for then reports on countries with which we have a trade imbalance, countries with which we have a trade agreement and their effectiveness, a review of the 232 national security tariffs, which does cover steel and aluminum from countries such as Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and elsewhere, as you mentioned, on stainless. And then we must keep in mind that I know prior to mid-March, March 15th, I believe is the date, the Europeans' retaliatory tariff on the United States go back into effect. Joe Biden negotiated in 2021 that he would suspend the tariffs on steel and aluminum from the EU bloc and Japan and UK and switch to a tariff rate quota system. The US agreed to keep that tariff rate quota system in place until December 31st of this year. The Europeans only agreed to keep the retaliatory tariffs off US products until March of this year in anticipation of Trump. So no matter what, we will need to either see the Europeans put off reinstatement of those tariffs or some kind of an agreement, and we do expect Trump to start in on the EU here very shortly.
And Omar, doesn't, am I mistaken, or Korea has a hard quota?
They have an absolute quota. So South Korea has an absolute quota. Brazil and Argentina have absolute quotas. You have a tariff rate quota on the UK, Japan, and the European Union 27 nation bloc. Couple others. So China plants currently in Mexico will be on hold. So, excuse me. So if you have a plant, any plants that are in Mexico, whether they're owned by Chinese, Mexicans, or United States, they are not subject to tariffs at this point coming in tonight. Again, he says 1 month, which taking literally means 12:01 a.m. on March 1st of this year. The tariffs on inputs coming in from Mexico would take effect as well. A question came in, whose responsibility is it to impose or collect the tariff? My understanding is that the importer must pay the tariff. If I ship a product to Mexico, do I need to put in place any collection efforts? And that's something you're going to need to work with your customer and with your supplier and with your broker on if there is going to be a deposit that's due. For example, in the United States, when they do anticipate anti-dumping or countervailing duties coming in, you are going to have to put in some kind of deposit that's held and that the broker hangs on to in the event that the duty goes in after you've already imported the product. So in this case, the importer pays the tariff. That's always the case. Whether you have an agreement with that importer to then do a discount or split it, do 12 and a half, 12 and a half, however it might be. But no, it's the importer of record that's bringing it in that is going to be subject to that tariff that's out there as well. And so as additional questions that are coming in there, what are some of the things that we can look at and strategies, and we'll talk about that here for 2 minutes. A couple other questions that we received are any U.S. states receiving electricity from Canada, such as New York, will the tariff affect how states and by how much? That's really a question, I think, for the experts over at the Bracewell. They have a great energy team that works on this. But going back to Paul's point, we saw the listing of the energy resources that would be considered an import. So yes, if those are purchased by utility, Paul, I would suspect that those are.
That is big. Yes. The answer is yes. We get a lot of electricity from Canada, I believe on the West Coast as well. And that is a big concern that if the Canadians would take some action regarding the electricity exports, it would be a big problem on the West Coast in particular.
Another question I was trying to clarify here with regards to services. So let me bifurcate this. If you're an engineer or a service and you're providing a service where you're not physically dealing with the product in person, or you're a consultant providing a service, as of now, those are not eligible. However, if you have a product that enters into Canada and goes through a QC or some other service in Canada, that product, when it's shipped back in the US, will have a tariff on its declared value as an article being imported under this action. Hopefully that helps clarify that question and not trying to create confusion. So even if you're not doing a value added, but doing some kind of added service to that product or inspection to that product, it isn't the service that is subject to the tariff. It will still be that cost of the product as a declared value entering in the United States is how they would do that. A few other coming in here. I'd just like to at least speak for a moment on strategies. This is not me, your lobbyist speaking, just having spoken with many of you all for a few decades now, and what you can be doing and talking to your customers. Speaking to your customers and suppliers now absolutely is the time. And just because Mexico is not going into effect tomorrow, do not think you are off the hook. Understanding strategies on how you're going to mitigate it, how you're going to share some of this, and if you believe that it's going to be long term, what could long term be? Again, USMCA negotiations have to get done by next year. Trump's not willing to wait that long. So does he increase the pressure if he's not getting what he wants? So what you see today, to what Paul's point, I think is, may not be what you're dealing with tomorrow or next week. And so to constantly be looking for that information and be flexible is important. The other side of that is having the conversation with your customers or former customers and say, this instability and uncertainty is going to continue for the next 4 years from this president and certainly for the next year. And you should be looking at this as an opportunity to try to sell your former and current customers and potentials on why they need to be sourcing domestically in order to avoid some of these uncertainties that you've got there as well.
And just to note that in 3 minutes at 3 o'clock Eastern, a scheduled call, it was already scheduled between a second call today between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump is set to take place. The analysis that we've been saying, and we heard that that a deal was not imminent, but that's just something to note, and we'll keep an eye on that they will be talking again at 3, and so we'll see what happens.
Well, when people are talking, that's all you can ask for in situations like this. Is when they're not talking, that makes it more complicated. So hopefully then they will come out and come to an agreement by this evening, but indications heading into that call, at least of now, are not likely to have a deal. Any other?
There's somebody had asked if how these 3 countries rank as the trading partners. I believe it's Canada, Mexico, China is the order, unless it might be Canada.
Canada's 14.8%, Mexico's 14.1%, and Canada and China is 11.8% of total.
Right. So yes, gold, silver, and bronze.
Yep, they are the top 3. Okay. We are coming up on the hour. You do all have our information. You know how to reach the teams at NTMA and PMA. And please note, this is fluid. Hopefully everything we've got was helpful to the extent that we've got it now. And as we do have more information, particularly when we get Federal Register notice with HTS documents, we'll be sure to get those out to everyone as well. Anything that you all can come up with, we're happy to see if we can get an answer for you. If not us, we'll find someone who can, to the extent that they know it too. Seeing no new questions come in. Okay,
Thank
Mike,
you.
Paul. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time today.